the thought was we go through the various wars that we fought and kind of focus on the soldiers who fought and died or just fought and some survived in those wars. And as it turns out, we've been in an awful lot of wars. And so it got pretty complicated. We're going to do the best we can to go through the various conflicts that the United States has been involved in. And
not go over an hour.
Yeah, over an hour.
And not go over an hour.
Not go over an hour. Yeah, I guarantee Jerry. So we're gonna do that, and of course the initial conflict that founded our country was the Revolution. And can anybody guess how many people in this local area fought actually in the Revolutionary War? How many?
Not from here, Paul from Woodson.
Okay. The answer is none, of course, because we weren't even there.
No, there was no.
We weren't.
So nobody lived here.
This area was not settled. This.
Oh,
Yeah.
No, we didn't say that, but that's all right.
Well, I guess, if you want to look at it that way, probably the people from the other side but even from the other side of the border, they came after the Revolution because almost all the settlers in St. Stephen came from the Loyalists on the East Coast. There were very few people here when the Revolution started. There were a few French fur traders who were trading up and down the river. Eastport had just started to be settled. There were a few people in Machias, but there was really no population base here before the Revolution.
Oops.
But we do have people who were involved in the Revolution, and we thought we'd mention some of those. This is the surrender of the British at
What's happened here?
Saratoga.
Saratoga, yes.
Saratoga, which was the most important battle in the Revolutionary War. It was the one that put this nation on the way to victory. And I put this up because there were people who settled in Calais who fought at Saratoga, and one of those individuals was Old Vance, William Vance, from Vance, Vanceboro is named after him, but he, in fact, established Bering, Maine, and he was quite a character, Old Vance was. He fought in the French and Indian Wars. He fought with Benedict Arnold at Saratoga. After the war, he decided, he heard that the English were offering territory in New Brunswick to anybody who would settle there, and so he became a British citizen. He went across the border and changed his loyalties to become a British citizen, and actually lived there for quite a few years, practiced law, and then in about 1810, he decided he wanted to be an American again. He came back and settled in Bering, and he was uneducated. He couldn't read, but he was a lawyer. So there you go. And in the War of 1812, which we'll talk about a little bit later, he set up a cannon up on a hill next to his house on the river. He called it Mount Defiance, and he indicated that any British who tried to get across the river, he was going to blow them away with his cannon. He's an interesting guy, but he was there. And of course, we had other people from this area. Why don't you give us the next slide? This is a painting that has probably no relation to reality. It's the Battle of the Margaretta, which was the first naval battle of this Revolutionary War. It was fought in Machias. And it actually is quite famous. They have Margaretta Days every year over there, and it's very well attended. It was an important historical event. And the first shot fired at from the clipper that was attacking the Margaretta was fired by a guy named Jonathan Knight. And Jonathan Knight was one of the original settlers of Calais. He came up over here after the Revolution. And what you're looking at here, is most people don't recognize this photograph.
No.
But this is Salmon Falls. Like, people are familiar with Salmon Falls. This is the railroad These are old, this is probably 1890 or so. This is the first railroad, maybe around 1900. This is the falls that you used to see before they tore them out in the last couple of years that flowed over the falls down the river. And this is Jonathan Knight's house. And for those who remember that their grandmothers talking about the poorhouse, my grandmother always told me that if I was wasteful, that I was going to put her in the poorhouse, and that was the poorhouse by the time in the
Nope.
early 1900s.
I can tell you where it is.
And
Yeah, it is sort of. Greg just asked where this is, but this is Knight's Corner. And actually, across the street, from like not directly across the street from the Sandwich Man, but there's the Sandwich Man, and then there's a little building where, God, what is it now? It's a marijuana shop or something.
yeah, it used to be motor vehicle
Then
too.
there's a road called Poorhouse Road or Poorhouse Lane, which goes down to the old railroad, the roundhouse.
Yeah.
And that's where this would be down.
And I
Yeah.
think that might be the school up in Milltown. You think?
I
Possible?
don't, well, I don't think so because
No.
it would be further to the right.
Okay. It's a big
It would be
building. I couldn't
further.
quite figure out what it was.
It is. It
Yeah.
looks like the back of a house, maybe.
Yeah.
Even on South. No, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's an old picture. Now, is this the end of your set for
Yeah,
me?
yeah.
In the cemetery, in the Calais cemetery, what we know, this is still the Revolution, isn't it? Yes.
Yes.
In the Calais cemetery, as far as I know, there are only four Revolutionary War veterans that are buried there. One of them is a man named John Bohannon. John Bohannon was on the crew of the Unity, which was a ship that attacked Margarita in Machias. So he was one of the people there. But as Alan said, there weren't any people living here then. These people came afterwards. Another was John Noble. And John Noble was actually from Delaware, I think. I know that he was in Delaware. He was in the army in Delaware. And he was captured by the British. And at some point after he was captured, he changed his allegiance and he swore allegiance to the king. And he came to St. Stephen with Nehemiah Marks, who was the founder of St. Stephen. And at some point, he had a lot of land in St. Stephen. At some point, he either sold that land or traded it, and it's not quite certain which. And he had a number of acres, something like 50 acres on the St. Croix. And it's hard to tell people that don't know where things are, but it would be beyond Devil's Head. It would be, no, it would be before Devil's Head. It would be before Devil's Head. There's a place that used to be called Hesslin's Motel, and it's all kind of derelict, and you can see that there was a motel unit off on the left. It's not Fox Point. No, it's before Fox Point. Do you know where Bonnie Chisholm's husband, Bob Lyons, lives? Well, it would be, no, it would be before that too.
Yeah.
It would be before that. Hesslin's is up.
Yeah.
It's up. That's right. And anyway, just before Hesslin's, that land was the Noble Farm. And it was for a long time. Even when I was a child, my mother used to take an old gentleman, Mr. Rideout, down to visit old Mr. Noble. So the Nobles were on that property for a really long time, and the house was still there. So He was he's one of the four. Another one is Samuel Tuttle. And Samuel Tuttle came from Chelsea, Massachusetts, and he moved up here to Calais, or he didn't move to Calais, Calais wasn't here, but he moved to this area, what was then northern Massachusetts, before the Revolution. When he heard that the Revolution had begun, he went back to Massachusetts and enlisted. And he was primarily in the Northwoods and along the Connecticut River. I don't know, I'm familiar with this, but I don't know if anyone else is. Along the Connecticut River, there were 4 forts: Fort number 1, Fort number 2, Fort number 3, and Fort number 4. And they were to, guard the Connecticut. Fort number 4 is in Charlestown, New Hampshire, and it has been recreated. So you can go there, like you can go to Sturbridge Village, and it's a stockade, and that's Fort number 4. And from there is the Crown Point Road, and the Crown Point Road goes to Saratoga. And he went from there to Saratoga, Samuel Tuttle did, and from there to West Point, and then he was working as an assistant engineer building forts in the West. And the fourth one is who? Is the Rich? No, let me hang on. I know it's not that I don't know, it's that I can't remember anymore. Samuel, no, that was Samuel Tuttle. Move to the next slide. It will tell you. Richard, no. Okay, go ahead.
Okay.
This is, yep, there we are. Richard Sanborn. I knew it, I just couldn't think. Richard Sanborn was the fourth of Revolutionary veteran that's buried in the Calais Cemetery. He was, well, we'll do this and we'll go back to Richard Sanborn.
Okay.
So,
Okay. So
this is Eastport.
So we'll move on from the Revolution. The next conflict we have is the War of 1812. And if I could somehow explain to you why we fought the War of 1812, I would be a genius. No one's quite sure. It had to do with impressing the British, impressing sailors. It had to do with tariffs. It was mostly just hostility left over, I think, from the Revolution and economic issues. And so the War of 1812 was fought to some extent in Eastport or along the Passamaquoddy Bay. There was a great demand after the Revolution. There was a great demand still in the United States for British goods, furniture and china and all sorts of things that came from England. And of course, because of our poor relationship with England at the time and the tariffs and port embargoes, it was hard to get them here legally. And the one place on the face of the earth where you had a close connection between the old country and the United States was the Passamaquoddy Bay, and Eastport was the main port. And so there was a lot of smuggling. There was a lot of, there was a lot going on in Eastport in that area at the time. And so when the War of 1812 broke out, the British, who had always contested whether Moose Island, which is now Eastport, was their territory or ours, eventually sent a fleet up with soldiers and troops and captured or took Fort Sullivan, which is here, which is a very prominent or at least what we have an Eastport historian here who can correct me on this sort of thing. Am I right so far, Wayne? Okay. So the British sent a fleet up of frigates and battleships with lots of troops on them. And it was clear to the folks at Fort Sullivan that they were not going to be able to resist the British, and eventually they agreed to turn the fort over to the British. And in 1814, the British took control of Fort Sullivan and essentially Passamaquoddy Bay. in terms of casualties in the war, because it was a surrender and there wasn't a battle, there were no battle casualties that we know of. But I think Wayne told me the other day that when the British took the fort, the enlisted men who were there were a number of them, 70 or 80, I guess, they were taken as prisoners of war and taken where, to Halifax or
Melville Island.
Melville Island. Okay. And a number of them died. And so there were casualties, actually. The officers, of course, were given parole because they were considered to be gentlemen and who would keep their word and not, again, fight the British, which is what you have to do if you want to get paroled. But the enlisted men, of course, they didn't trust them, and so they took them prisoner, and there were a number of casualties there. There was one other fellow, Jerry, that we know died.
Richard Sanborn.
Richard Sanborn.
So we can move to the next slide probably. Yeah. Richard Sanborn, and this sort of bridges, because Richard Sanborn was a Revolutionary War veteran, but also a veteran of the War of 1812. He was both. And before I do that, I just thought of something that I wanted to tell you, just in terms of our connection loosely to the Revolution. In the Calais Cemetery, there were two other people who have prominent connection to the Revolution. One is Lydia Christopher, and she was the sister-in-law of Nathan Hale, and she's buried in the Calais Cemetery. And the other is a woman, Annie McBean Hatton, whose great-great-grandfather was Matthew Thornton, who was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. So they are both in the Calais Cemetery. Now, Richard Sanborn, as it says, died and was interred at Eastport while that town was held by the English, August the 7th, 1814. He was a soldier of the Revolution and of the War of 1812. What we don't know, and evidently his wife or his family put the stone up. We don't know where he is in Eastport, and we really don't know how he died, whether he was just there and simply died, got ill, or something. So we don't know that he was a casualty, but he was a soldier of the Revolution. And another thing about Eastport that you often read is that at the time of the War of 1812, Eastport was a rather important port on the eastern seaboard, much more than we might think at this particular time.
Okay. We're going to go on. We're going to stay with the War of 1812, although we're going to jump ahead a little bit because Jerry's going to tell you about.
Yes. And why did we put this in this?
Well, I'll explain it, Jerry. I'll explain it.
Okay. I can't remember why it's there. I know what it is.
We're claiming as a casualty of the War of 1812.
Oh, yes.
William Pike. William Pike was one of the original settlers of Calais. He had a number of children, but two of them, one of them was James Shepherd Pike, who was the ambassador to The Hague for Abraham Lincoln while he was president.
And worked with Horace Greeley and
very, very famous man in his time. And the other was Frederick Pike, who was a U.S. senator, who was instrumental in the impeachment of Andrew Jackson back in the 1830s. So William was a very important person. And in 1818, am I right, when the British turned it back over? Was it 1818? Yeah. He got in his rowboat here in Calais and rowing down to the celebration. And somewhere off Liberty Point in Robinson, the boat overturned, he drowned. And so we're claiming him as a casualty of the War of 1812. And he's really important because of his sons, and Jerry will tell you about Ida May.
Frederick Augustus Pike was married to Mary. This says Mary Langdon, but that was a that was a pseudonym for writing. She was Mary Hayden Green Pike, and we mentioned her when we talked about the houses in Calais. But Frederick Augustus Pike was the Speaker of the House for the legislature in Maine, and he also was a member of Congress. And they were very prominent people. And when we were talking about the houses, they had two houses built by Asher Basford, who built this house. Ida May, and this is probably not new to most of you because I've mentioned it before, but Ida May was a very important book written prior to the Civil War. And Mary Hayden Green had gone to the South and observed slavery, and she returned and wrote this book, which it is said was as influential, if not more so, than Uncle Tom's Cabin for the abolitionist movement. Uncle Tom's Cabin has stayed, in the forefront of people's knowledge, but Ida May has sort of disappeared since then. And we'll actually reference her once again when we get to the Civil War.
Okay. So after the War of 1812, we had a brief period without conflict until about 1837-38. And some of you probably visited this building. I don't know if you have or have not. What does it look like? The Alamo in San Antonio. And of course, we had expanded westward and southwestward, and the United States had, and we were in conflict with Mexico over what are now our southern states of Texas and Colorado and Arizona and all those states. And so there was a period of time where there were essentially the borders of the Southwest were in dispute, and every once in a while there would be a flare-up. And this is about 1837 or 38. And for the next 10 years, there were minor skirmishes along the border. Whoops, I'm sorry, you can go back. I guess I mean. But what happened in 1848 was the full-scale war called the Mexican-American War, which occurred on the border down there. And a lot of local people went down there with the U.S. military and fought in that war. And there were some prominent men, especially from Eastport. Where was that? There was a Brigadier General Henry Price of Eastport, graduated from West Point. He fought the Seminoles and Creeks in Florida, and in the Mexican War was severely wounded at Molina del Rey and won promotion for citations for bravery. Another Eastport General, Napoleon J.T. Dana, graduated from West Point and fought in the Mexican War, seriously wounded. And so we were, there were quite a few people from this area who were engaged in that war. It was a war that was not well reported in the press, and there's not a lot of statistics on it, but it's undoubtedly true that a good number of people from this area participated, and we may have had casualties that we don't, were never recorded. The other fellow who was prominent locally here was a fellow was the third William Vance. I talked about William Vance, old Vance from Bering. He had two sons later in life, both named William. The first was a doctor who was hanged as a pirate by the British, and the second was William Vance, who was the most famous photographer on the West Coast during the gold rush. And if you Google William Vance photographer, you'll find an amazing collection of his photography. Most of it was lost, but what remains is quite good, and he was well known at the time. So it was a war that there's not much history involved. I mean, reported on, it's not well known, but there were a lot of people in this area who went to the Southwest and fought in the war of 1846 to 1848. So, okay. And now we come to the Civil War. And I'll just briefly, this is Joel Haycock, soldier here. He was a leader. He left here as a captain of the unit. He became a major and led the unit almost throughout the entire war. He lived on High Street.
Yes, he did.
Yeah,
You want me to?
tell us about it.
Yep, he lived on High Street in a house, a house that's not there anymore, on the corner of Monroe Street and High. And Joel Haycock was, I believe, the first Calais resident to enlist in the Civil War. And when the Civil War broke out, General Whiddon started to put a company together, which became the 6th Maine Infantry, or was joined with other units to become the 6th Maine Infantry. And General Whiddon was, we've mentioned him before also, he was a self-proclaimed general. I don't think he'd ever fought in anything, but he made himself a general. This is just a little clip from the Calais paper, but the Calais Volunteer Company A, Captain J.C. Haycock, left here on Tuesday morning at 7 o'clock for Fort Sullivan Eastport. They were escorted to the boat by the 2 fire companies, preceded by the Calais Cornet Band. The citizens, to the number of upwards of 2,000 persons, turned out to see them off, and many of their friends and relatives accompanied them to Eastport. They left in fine spirits amid a salvo of guns and the loud and hearty cheers of the populace. They are all fine, hearty-looking fellows, and that they will do credit to themselves and honor to the town from which they hail, we have not the least doubt. And what it makes me think of is how often at the beginning of a war, how almost jubilant people seem to be as they send people off, but things really change. Joel Haycock was killed at Fredericksburg, and I'll just read this section that was written about that. Foremost among his comrades, Major Haycock rushed forward to the terrible encounter, and halfway across the slaughter pen, he fell, pierced by a Minnie ball, and expired almost instantly, thus sealing his devotion to his country's cause by his heart's blood. The fierce, wild charge of his regiment swept away the opposing enemy as chaff is swept before the wind, and their colors were planted in triumph upon the ramparts. But even in the first flush of victory, Colonel Burnham, the commander of the regiment, wept as a child when he beheld the prostrate and lifeless form of this valiant and true-hearted warrior. They buried him where he had fallen, halfway up the green slope, which had drunk so deeply of the nation's best blood. He fills a soldier's grave, and one ever to be honored. In addition, at Fredericksburg, Frank Holmes was also killed. Frank Holmes lived in this house. He was the son of Dr. Holmes. Dr. Holmes had 3 sons. The first, one of them was an infant who died in the cottage when they lived next door. And then the other was too young for the Civil War. He was born after they moved to this house in 1850. But Frank was certainly an important part of this family, and it seems that it's quite likely that Dr. Holmes never recovered from the death of Frank, because he himself died only a year or so after Frank died. Frank had a friend, Frank Barnard. Frank Barnard lived across the lots in the house that is next to the Masonic Hall. And Frank Barnard was also killed in the Civil War, but he was killed at Rappahannock Station. And if you go to the cemetery, in addition to Frank Barnard, and there may be others because there are a lot, there are the Coy brothers, John Coy and William Wallace Coy. And they're up at the if you go up the center lane of the cemetery to almost to the very, very back, where you would take a right, the last right you can take, there is a little white stone, and the two brothers are, one is on one side of the same stone, and the other is on the other side. John Coy, William Wallace Coy, and Frank Barnard were all shot the same day, November the 7th, 1863. John Coy died instantly. Frank Barnard and, no, I'm sorry, William Wallace Coy died instantly. He was the younger of the two brothers. John was shot in the hip, and he went to hospital in Washington, and his leg was amputated, and he died 2 days before Christmas that year. And Frank Barnard died, I think, on December the 1st from the wounds sustained at Rappahannock Station. So there were those three there. In addition, there was also, well, there are others too, but there was, well, when I said we would make reference again to Ida May, Mary Hayden Green Pike, had a brother. She lived in the house where Dr. Gould lives now, just up the street. And her father came from Eastport. Her brother Thomas Green was killed at Cedar Mountain. And if you go to the Calais Cemetery, in the same part of the cemetery at the top of the central lane, where the Coy brothers are on the right, on the left is the tallest monument in the Calais Cemetery. It's a huge black granite obelisk, and that's Mary Hayden Pike Green and Frederick Augustus Pike. And next to it, you'll see a broken column, and that is for her brother Thomas Green, who was killed at Cedar Mountain. And the symbolism of that broken was a life taken, early, that the column was broken. Now the other one is Rule Furlong, and he was also killed at Rappahannock Station. And I think there was, yes. From Ken Ross's book on the Civil War, he writes, "In the glory and horror of battle, if there is any glory, Captain Rule Furlong, a teacher from Milltown, outdid his Company D predecessor, Joel Haycock. Also a bold fighter at Hagerstown, Maryland, he assembled 24 men and attacked an enemy force, killing and wounding 21 and capturing 39. Rappahannock Station, where he led Company D, gave him an opportunity to repeat the Hagerstown performance on a grand scale. According to eyewitnesses, he leaped over the enemy's works, and after employing his revolver, fought with a clubbed musket, swinging it around his head until he fell dead. After the battle, his body was found among a pile of dead, several of whom had been killed by the blows of a musket stock." So he's another one of our Civil War heroes. But as in all wars, of course, the Civil War was the bloodiest and had the most casualties of any war. If you've seen Ken Burns' Civil War from a number of years ago, but it was very well done. Okay.
That's a good question.
Yes.
A couple questions.
Yeah.
I don't know my history.
Oh.
What year was Fredericksburg? Like what year?
Fredericksburg was 1863.
The summer of 1863. There were two battles of Fredericksburg. This is the second battle of Fredericksburg.
Yeah.
Fredericksburg is the low line.
Yeah.
And the Confederates were on the
So he
hill.
served for a couple of years.
Yeah.
Yes.
And is there any knowledge of whether he and Frank Holmes might have served in the same company or not known each other? Or is that?
Frank Holmes
And who?
and Joel Haycock.
Oh, God, yes.
Yeah,
They were in the same unit.
Yes.
They were the same-
Yeah.
They were all the Calais
Yeah.
men.
And-
were in that particular unit, of which Joe Haycock was the captain and Ralph Furlong was the lieutenant.
Yep.
And yes,
Yeah, I just had a little commission, the 6th Maine was considered down east regiment,
yeah,
but most of the
Mm,
soldiers there.
we're from down east.
That-
Down east.
yeah, it
Sure.
was down
There's a
east.
book out called Son,
Yeah.
by-
Yes, I read that.
Excellent book.
Yeah.
Mm.
Okay.
And Joel Haycock of the Legion Post, the Grand Army of the Republic, the GAR post, it used to, the old GAR hall used to be on Lowell Street,
Mhm.
burned in the 1960s, but it was named for Joel Haycock, the Joel Haycock Post. And that where did we get that from? The Burnses?
Yes.
One of the
Yes,
Burns
one of the
girls?
Burns girls. It was
Yeah, and then we don't know.
That's raw.
We don't know to whom it belonged,
Yeah.
but anyway.
Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to briefly, this is Mary's Heights in Fredericks, in Virginia. And this is where Joel Haycock died, Frank Holmes died. In fact, I took this picture. I went to this as a memorial. There's a federal national monument there to the battles of Fredericksburg. And it doesn't look like much, does it? It doesn't look like much. But the fact is, 84 men either died or were wounded or were captured and taken prisoner of war in 3 hours on this hill. This is Mary's Heights. And they were all from this area. I mean, this is as Wayne says, these units were all from Eastport, Princeton, Calais, Columbia Falls, Machias. It was the worst day, obviously, that this area has ever experienced in terms of war. What was the next one? The hill you saw is over here.
On that side.
This is the wall. The wall is still there. And this is these are Confederate. This is the Confederates behind this wall, and the main unit had to somehow scale the wall and then get up the hill, and they managed to do it. They managed to do it somehow. But I mean, the casualties were just phenomenal. Yes, ma'am?
It was one of the few bayonet charges that was successful in the Civil War.
Yeah, yeah.
That's all they had left. That's why they.
Right. Yeah.
But they succeeded.
It was a terrible battle for just a few hours, and I'd say 84 local men were either killed, captured, or wounded in a matter of hours, and it devastated the town. And I mean, we're talking about not just Calais, but Eastport, Machias, Princeton, Crawford. If you look through Ken Ross's book, the lists, the men who died in that battle, they're from every community. Next slide. And Jerry's already talked about Ralph Furlong. He was known as the Calais Giant, surrounded by the bodies of his enemies at Rappahannock Station. He was a Milltown man. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, a teacher.
And this is a ragtag unit left of the main unit after the battle. There aren't many left. And this is the list it came with the Calais Advertiser of all of the men who went off with Joel Haycock.
Yeah, those the casualties?
No, this is the unit when they left town.
Yeah.
They left town.
Yeah.
This lists everybody who was with them. And the ones that came back, some of them did come back in one piece, but very few. And there were a lot of them died, and a lot of them were totally disabled. They suffered. The percentage of casualties suffered by this unit was just phenomenal for any war. Okay, so let's move on. Next war. What's that? The battleship Maine getting blown up down in.
Remember the Maine.
Remember the Maine. And there it is before it got blown up. Go ahead. Here we are. The Calais troops marching off to get on the road Standish to head downriver to go to Portland to go to Cuba to
Do
fight.
do you know where this is?
Jerry, why don't you tell them where it is? You got your little pointer?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah,
This is what was known as Brown's Corner.
yeah.
And General Whidden, I told you, was not really a general, but this was his house. And we talked before about Noah Smith and Seth W. Smith, and the Smith house is here. This is where the Dollar Tree is. And but when we were children, well, these things were, yeah, Martin's is in the back there. Sure. In fact, right there where that house is would be just about where the driveway is to go into Martin's. But when Alan and I were children, I mean, these houses were still there. This wasn't, but I don't remember that. Do you, Al?
No, that was
No.
gone.
But I think I remember this, and I do remember all these houses. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just a little, go back just a bit. That building there, my uncle Bob Alexander had a
Oh, yes.
store in
Yes,
that.
yes, I
He had
remember
a
him.
store in that.
Yeah.
He never sold anything, but he had a store
No.
in there.
Do you remember? Yeah. So
Okay.
you remember that building?
I do.
Yeah. So I do
yeah.
too.
was
I
just
just
little.
sometimes I'm not sure if I really do or not, but yeah.
Go ahead. Okay, so these are the boys going off to the Spanish-American War. That's Rob Golding right there.
Oh yes, Rob
Yeah.
Golding from the Golding Road
Yeah.
in
That's the
in
deserter.
Perry.
Go to the next photograph. Go to the next one. It tells us who they all are. Nick Knights, he deserted.
Yeah, and it's probably one of the Knights, like Knights' Corner,
Yeah, Knights
or the
Corner.
Knights Farms down where the
be.
college is now.
So they were all Calais Eastport people. And
Deserter,
the
yeah.
photograph was 1898. We have some letters from Ernest Hill, which are kind of interesting. He written from Cuba. Wallace Purrington shot dead with a
the
revolver. We don't know whether that was the circumstances of that, but go on to the next photograph.
And this came from Virginia Pottle, didn't it?
Yeah, that
Virginia Pottle is related somehow. I'm not sure how it goes to Rob Golding. And the fine artist people live in Rob Golding's house on the Golding Road.
Mhm. And there's another picture that's supposed to be local. I colorized it. This is whether it's taken. And these are soldiers down in Cuba. They're supposed to be local. I'm trying to figure out who they are. And maybe someday we will, but
We don't know who they
we'll
are.
go by.
They look good anyway.
And who is this? Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy and his Rough Riders. Yeah, Teddy was there with his Rough Riders. They didn't actually do much damage, the Rough Riders, but they didn't need to. The war was
Looks
over
like
in
who?
almost no time.
Oh, it does. You're right. It does look like John Wayne behind him.
Huh?
To the left
Oh,
of
this guy here? Yeah. I was trying to. It probably was John Wayne.
It
Go
does
ahead,
look
the
like
next
John
photograph.
Wayne.
And the reason I put that up there is Guy Murchie, a local guy. He was with the Rough Riders, and he was one of the favorites of Teddy Roosevelt. And in fact, when Roosevelt became president, he appointed Guy Murchie to a number of important political posts. And he fought with the Rough Riders. But as I say, the Spanish-American War was not much of a war here, but it was in the Philippines. And a lot of men from this area ended up in the Philippines. And whether any of them died in combat, I don't know. It's hard to get records on them. But certainly for every person who fought in the Spanish-American War, or whether in Cuba or the Philippines, your chances of dying of disease were 20 or 50 times greater than ever getting shot. So there probably were people who succumbed either going or coming or in the theater of battle to diseases. But it was a short war, and we ended up with Cuba, which has kind of become an albatross, but nonetheless,
Yeah.
move on.
And the Murchie house
Yeah.
was right next to St. Anne's Church. And also, we get a little confused when we said we're not going to try to sort it out, but whether there were two Guy Murchies.
Well, there were two.
There were
father
two,
and a son.
a father and son, and no, but one of them, if you're familiar with the children's book, Miss Rumphius, where she goes around spreading lupin seeds, and it's written by a woman named Barbara Cooney. Barbara Cooney was married to Guy Murchie from Calais. They were divorced, but they were. But I don't think it. I think it must be the son.
I think it's the son.
I think it has to be because she. I mean, she. I don't know when she died. I can't remember, but I remember I had her speak when I used to have children's authors speaking all the time, and that would have been in the 80s or 90s, probably the 90s.
And Guy Murchie, the elder, I'm pretty sure it was the one who wrote the Sentinel River, one of the histories
Yes.
of this,
Yeah,
of
the
this
St.
area.
Croix, the Sentinel River.
Okay,
That's this Guy Murchie, isn't it?
yes,
Yes.
I think so. Okay, Pancho Villa. There he is, right there. No, there he is. That's
There he is,
Pancho.
yeah.
The Mexicans never got over our stealing their land, and so every once in a while there'd be depredations. And just before we entered the First World War, Pancho came across the border and raided Arizona and a number of places in Mexico, and a lot of local men went down and were engaged in that battle. And at least one was killed. A guy from Eastport, Ralph Ray, was killed on the Mexican border in 1916, and the VFW post was named after him. And I presume, I don't know if you know, he must be one of the
Mustard
Ray
Ray?
family, Ray Mustard. You think he is? Okay, well, just the name's kind of a, yeah. Anyway, there were a number of people from this area. I know that my wife, my mother's married to Joe Botha for a while, and he was from over the river, and there were one of his uncles went down there and fought. So it was, we do have a local connection with those particular skirmishes. And then we come to the First World War. These are the Sherman brothers, for whom the Legion Post was named for many years and still is named. They were from St. Stephen, outside of St. Stephen. They moved over here about 1900 with their family. At one point, they lived over on the Union, I believe, and at one point they had a farm up on Manning Street.
Oh,
Yeah, according to the old registers. And they were among the first to enlist in First World War. Go ahead. And there was quite a bit of publicity about them, the brothers going off to war. And go ahead. And they were the only two men of all the men in Calais, and there were a couple, 300 of them who went to war, who died. The only two who were killed in the First World War from Calais. And they died about a month apart. On to the next slide. Just quickly, this is the battle line, the German Allied battle line. Fred died right here, Zivray, in June of 1918, and a few months after 1 month after he died, the Germans made their last desperate roll of the dice and tried to take Paris. And they managed to get down as far as Chateau Thierry, and Harry was killed there. And so they died within a month of each other, and their bodies were brought back in 1922, I think it was. It was several years before their bodies were returned, and they're both buried in the Calais Cemetery. And the service was held at the Baptist church. And it was, a big event, obviously. But they were the only two from Calais. Now, there were a number from Princeton. There was an Albert Mercer from Princeton who died. There were several from Eastport. We did lose a number of local people in the war, but the Sherman brothers were the only two from Calais.
Look how it says that all businesses will be closed from 2 to 4, and the schools will be closed during the funeral. Judge Fowler lived right on the corner of Elm Street across from the park. House is gone.
It's important to point out that this is a photograph of some Passamaquoddy Indians from the Pleasant Point Reservation. It indicates that the two of these fellows, Charlie Lola and Moses Neptune, died in the war. I should also point out that they were only 2 of 7 of Passamaquoddies from the reservation who died in the First World War. And this is a community of a few hundred. And Calais is a community of 6,000 to 7,000 back then. And we lost two people. We lost the Sherman brothers, and they lost 7 with incredible numbers of wounded. I think there were 18 who served, 7 died, and I guess, go ahead, Wayne.
Just a little background there. A number of the Passamaquoddy served in the Canadian forces when we joined the war.
Yeah.
So this is just the American version?
Yeah, this is just the American forces. Yeah, I don't have the figures on that. And of course, the Canadians suffered far more casualties than we did because they were in the war so much longer. So it's quite possible that there were more. And of course, we don't recognize the contributions that they made, but they certainly pulled more than their weight in both this war and in the Second World War. So go ahead. Second World War. Okay. This is from the yearbook, Calais yearbook, in 1945. Already, you lost 7 people who graduated fairly recently from Calais High School. They weren't the only casualties from Calais. I mean, these are just the ones that had been in school recently at Calais Academy. And the number of casualties total was, I think, 12 or 15 dead, and I don't know how many wounded, but we'll be talking. And there's John Noble again.
Who's the descendant of the other John Noble, the earlier John Noble.
Go ahead. And there's a picture of John, and they had obviously his and Jerry, did you have that letter?
Yes, I do. Yep. And this was this John Noble?
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a letter that he wrote to his parents, and it's dated September the 2nd, 1944. And it says, "This is the first opportunity I have had to write since I moved here. I have finally got into an outfit, so things are a little better now. I'm with a bunch of swell fellas, and I'm not going to be transformed around like I have been. I never realized just how big France is until I got here. We have sure seen a lot of it. You have read in the papers about the welcome the soldiers get. I have been given everything except the kitchen sink so far. Whenever we stop in a town, the people were coming running out of their houses and give us wine, champagne, cognac, potatoes, pears, plums, eggs, apples, and everything like that. Oh yes, and lots of bread made just like a donut and about a foot across. I like it. The most of it is made out of German flour, and it's as brown as gingerbread. Every night we have to sleep out with only one blanket and our shelter half wrapped around us. Gets pretty cold, but I sleep good. We've been the first soldiers to go through quite a few of these towns, and we're actually right on the heels of the Jerrys. When we come through, the church bells start ringing and everyone starts celebrating. When you march through a town, I guess every soldier shakes hands with every French man, woman, child, and in town, and we get kissed by quite a few. In one town we went through, the people had got 20 women who had been sleeping with the Germans, and they had some sort of a trial and then cut off all their hair. They were sure a funny looking sight. We're traveling so fast now that we don't see any fighting. I guess we're lucky. I hope we never see any. The Jerrys are leaving a lot of equipment along the road, so I guess they must be in a hurry. I'll have to get this in the mail, so I will have to quit now. Excuse the writing because I'm doing it on a bus about the size of a Cracker Jack. I haven't had any mail now for over 3 weeks, so I ought to get some soon. Write often to the new address. Love to both of you. And he died 2 weeks later. And probably, as Alan said earlier,
Yeah.
his parents probably
Probably
didn't
didn't get the
receive the
letter.
letter until after he had died.
And of course, there was a funeral, Night Memorial Methodist Church for John. The other interesting local connection we have is this fellow here. Go on to the next slide. And he is Stephen Groves. He was a hero of the Battle of Midway. And he died, obviously, defending the fleet. This is written by Jay Hinson, who you all know. And Jerry can tell you more about that family. I'm not real familiar with them. They lived.
Well, the Groves family, actually the boys, Stephen, and there may have been another one, but Stephen and Lawrence, Larry Groves, I think they went to school, I think, in Millinocket, but they moved here at some point, and they lived on Lincoln Street. And the person that some of you might remember, I don't know if you would or not, Larry Groves, for many years, I think he worked on the bridge. It would be Stephen's brother.
Mhm.
And Stephen is buried in the cemetery at the very top. You go up the middle road, right to the top, and you take that left-hand turn, and he's along the woods about a halfway down. He's easy to find. But Larry Groves lived for many years, he and his wife, in the little cape on Hinckley Hill that David Mitchell lived in more recently. And in fact, that was the Granger house, and it had been empty for a long time. Nothing had ever been done with it. I forgot now. 8 fireplaces, I think, is a very early house. And Mrs. Groves really restored it beautifully. And she had all the right antique furniture, and she did it in Williamsburg paint colors, and it was a showplace for many years. But they lived there for a very long time. But so that his brother continued to live here, until for decades after the war. Okay, now this is the Korean War.
Mhm.
This is a page from the broadcast, which doesn't mean anything to some of you. The broadcast, I don't know if they still do. They still have the broadcast? I don't know. Do they?
I think
The
it's
broadcast is
yearbook.
the high school yearbook, and it was for ever and ever. This is from the 1953 yearbook, and the yearbook was actually dedicated to Florence Boone, who was still teaching when we went to high school. The top 2 people, Mr. Beaudry was a teacher at the school, and he had died, so it was in memoriam for him. But it wasn't a connection with the Korean War. And this boy was killed in a car accident. But these 2 boys, Charles Graham and John Gay, were both killed in Korea. There were 3 Calais boys killed in Korea. And so this is John Gay. He had graduated in 1945 and was killed.
There's a yearbook.
That's from his yearbook page. This is William Poole. And William Poole was older than the other two boys. That the last one graduated in 1944. One of them was 44 and one was 45. This fellow graduated in 1934, and he actually spent he enlisted in 1943. He graduated in 1941. He graduated in 1934. He enlisted in 1943, and no, I'm wrong. I'm confusing people. I'm sorry. He did graduate in 1941, and he enlisted in 1943. He spent the next 7 years until he died in the service, and he actually, you can see, he was part of the D-Day invasion of Normandy and was awarded the Bronze Star. And after that, he went to Korea before the Korean War to train troops. Then he went to Hawaii, where he trained people, and he was stationed there until the Korean War, and went back. And in 14 days after he went to Korea, he was killed. But I wanted to mention that, if I can see this is really fine. This is an article from the Calais Advertiser, but it just kind of, to me, it sort of shows how things are somewhat different now. This gentleman was awarded great honor after he was killed, and he was brought by train with full military rights, and he had a military escort from New York City to the train station here in Calais. And then there was a contingency from the Veterans of Foreign Wars and from the Legion of about 30 men, and they met the train, and then they accompanied the coffin up to Church Street to where May's funeral home is now, but it was Everett Scott at that time. On Sunday before the funeral, another contingency took the flag draped coffin to the Methodist Church, and they had a sentinel at his head and at his foot for the hour or so before the service began. And then at the cemetery, they were met at the gate. Dow Air Force Base sent the military honors and musician to play, and it was really a great honor for this young fellow. But I think there was, yes, I'll read just the last paragraph of this. Thus was laid to rest, and it also shows, you'll tell the difference in language. And this is 1950, which doesn't seem that long ago, but there's a great difference in language. Thus was laid to rest one of the most popular young men of the current generation of this city. Sergeant Poole was an active and energetic student, interested in athletics, outstanding in baseball and basketball, both for his school and later for the city. In those days, there was a city team as well as the high school team. In the service, he performed outstanding work in World War II, took part in the Great Norman Invasion, won the Bronze Star for heroic action in France. He chose the Army for his career, re-enlisting when his service was terminated, and was on duty as an instruction in Korea and later in Hawaii before the outbreak of the Korean War. He gave his life in the same brilliant, enthusiastic service that characterized him here at home. So that was what appeared in the paper at the time.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, now we're Vietnam.
His ambition when he, oh, this is for
This is
I'm sorry.
Vietnam.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this is the last.
This is
local person
yeah,
who
you've gotten to
died.
the end of, this is our last slide, isn't
This
it?
is our last slide. No, I'm not sure. I may have another slide. Ira Perkins fought Vietnam, and he's the last local that I
He was-
know of to have died in.
He was the only
combat.
one.
Yeah, the only one.
He's the only
died in
person from
Vietnam.
Calais who died in Vietnam.
Go on to the next. Let's go on to the next photograph. No more. There's his picture. He wanted to be a Marine, and he
children when I
was.
first
Go
started
ahead.
teaching school here.
And this is an article in the Bangor Daily News, what does it say?
He was already.
67. Which is announces that he's been awarded the Silver
I
Star,
was in high school.
which is the highest award for bravery, short of the Congressional Medal of Honor.
Mm.
And he died in this way, unfortunately. He was a Marine. He served in what was called I Corps in Vietnam, which was the northernmost district of Vietnam, bordered on the North Vietnamese border. It was an area, in fact, where I was stationed when I was in Vietnam. It was an important and very lethal part of the country because the A Shau Valley went from Laos and Cambodia over to the coast, and it was a main supply route of the North Vietnamese to get their soldiers supplies. And so there was a lot of fighting along the A Shau Valley and in I Corps. There were no roads, and what was ordinarily done in any kind of assault was a helicopter assault. Dozens and dozens of helicopters full of soldiers would descend on a rice paddy or a village, and everyone would jump out and engage. Well, they hopefully engage the enemy. And the problem with a helicopter assault is that a helicopter is a very, very soft target when it's landing and taking off. It's a big machine. It takes time to get up. It takes time to go down. And anybody, a 17-year-old Viet Cong with a rifle, all you got to do is hit the back rotor or whatever, and that thing will spin around and crash. And so, in this particular case with Ira Perkins, apparently he was involved in a helicopter assault. The helicopter got on the ground fine, or at least got close enough to the ground to get the soldiers off. Now, as soon as the helicopter is anywhere near the ground, everybody jumps off as quickly as they can because they want to get someplace where they can get themselves dug into the ground. And the real people in danger are the crew of the helicopter because they have to sit there hovering over like a foot above the terrain until everybody's off that helicopter. And so it was a really dangerous situation, especially if you were in what was called a hot landing zone. And apparently in this particular case, Perkins got off the helicopter, and perhaps most of his unit got off the helicopter, but someone hit the helicopter and managed to, it ended up crashing, and they were shooting at the wounded pilot of the helicopter. And he got out of the hole he dug for himself in the ground, I'm sure, and ran back to try to help drag the pilot of that chopper away to safety, and he was shot and killed in that effort.
Mm-hmm.
So this chopper's been shot down, and so it was a scene like this. This would be after the action's over, but at some point it would have been a lot of firing going on. So it was an incredibly brave thing to do.
And he had left four children.
Huh?
I think he had left four children.
Yeah.
I think the youngest one was only months old.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So anyway, he was the last person that I know of who was killed in combat, defense of the country, and that would be 1967. And I'm not sure he's buried here, I believe.
Yes, he is. He's in the
buried
Calais
here.
Cemetery. Yeah. And he's the only Calais name on the Vietnam War wall.
Yeah. But he was awarded the Silver Star, which you richly deserve, right? So anyway, that's the end that of the program. Hopefully we won't have to do another one. Update you.
Let's hope not.
But I don't know, does anybody have any questions? I think we probably run over time here.
I don't know what time it is.
Well, the transport helicopter, you'd have been able to take 8 or 10 soldiers in it. And depending on, there were a number of different size helicopters. But you just crammed as many soldiers as you could in one of them and took off to the landing zone and everyone jumped out just as
Hope
fast
for
as
the
you could
best.
get out of the helicopter.
I didn't go to
I'll tell you a war story. The first time I was on a helicopter flying out
Grounded.
into the bush, I noticed that everybody was sitting on their helmets. And I said to myself, I asked one of the guys, I said, what are you sitting on your helmets for? He just pointed down here. He says, because they're going to be shooting up at us. So I took my helmet off and sat on it. But I was never in a situation where we hit a hot landing zone where we were under fire from the time that we started landing. That was the most terrifying experience, as I understand it, from any soldier. To realize you're coming in, settling down slowly and all of a sudden the rocket propellant grenades and the fire is coming in, the tracers. And that's what happened to our Perkins, and that's what happened to this helicopter, I'm sure. So that's the end of the story. Thank you.
What did I?